Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. Our guest today is Oliver Burkeman. Oliver is a British journalist and author renowned for his insightful exploration of psychology and philosophy. He wrote the popular Guardian column, This Column Will Change Your Life, and is the best-selling author of 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. His latest book, Meditations for Mortals, offers a practical philosophy of imperfectionism, encouraging readers to embrace life's limits and focus on what actually matters. And this is going to be the topic of our discussion today. So hello, Oliver, welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Okay, well, can you start off by just telling us a bit about your background? What prompted you to get into journalism and why the focus on psychology?
I think the journalism part, I kind of never really ever wanted to do anything else. I was very sort of a very one-track mind in this respect. So from when I was a little kid, I was sort of making sort of newsletters that I was forcing my classmates to read and all the rest of it. That probably had a lot to do with sort of growing up in a household where the Guardian on the breakfast table was the source of all authority.
Sure.
In the world. Psychology sort of emerged fairly quickly as I got going in my journalistic career, just because, you know, whenever I had the opportunity, to write about what I wanted to write about, these sort of topics would come to the fore. And I think in some pretty central way, I've just used this as an opportunity for personal therapy of various kinds for decades now. There was, in the early stages of it, you know, there was a wonderful alibi. If you're sort of a little bit embarrassed to read certain kinds of books or talk about certain kind of topics, it's great to say you're just researching it for work, right? It gives you a wonderful reason to go into the murkier bits of human psychology and your own psychology. So I guess that was where that sort of came from, and it's just where my interests have always naturally led me.
And why did you choose to write this particular book? What was the motivation behind it?
The most recent one, Meditations for Mortals, is, for me, I mean, there are lots of different reasons, and the way one book emerges out of the last one is, we can talk about if you want, but I think a simple way of putting it is, for me, this book is an attempt to grapple with this very widespread truth that it's possible to have quite clear ideas about how you'd like to live or show up for life and what you think is the meaningful way to be a human, and then just like not to actually do it for months and years on end, for there to be this big gap between the knowing and the doing. And I was sort of looking at whether I could make a book that was not only about that gap, but also could actually actively help people close it. And part of the answer that I have, I guess, is that I think, again, is the sort of in terms of the personal motivation for it, is this sense that I had for a very long time of being kind of on the back foot with life, right? Just a few months away maybe from finally figuring out what I was supposed to be doing, or just a few months away from getting on top of all my to-dos. And I think, you know, getting a little bit older has a salutary effect here, because
Sure.
You can't carry on telling yourself that real life is shortly about to begin. You know, after maybe your 30s or something, right? It gets a little bit, it gets increasingly implausible that the moment of truth is in the future. So I wanted to sort of write a book about taking action on the things that matter right now.
Great. I really like the way you organised the book. That there was like a short chapter for each. For a period of 28 days. So it was like, is that, what was the thinking behind that?
Well, I don't know. It's often the way that I've found anyway with books, that you have to sort of figure out what they want to be. I know that sounds a bit pretentious, but it's so the earliest stage of this book, I was thinking, was it going to be one of those kind of page a day for a year kind of books? Was that the way to do it? Or a chapter every week for 52 weeks of a year? And the thing that really came clear again, with a lot of conversations with my brilliant American and British editors, it wasn't just me. There was something really right about this idea of a month or 28 days. So firstly, I wanted it to have that kind of temporal structure because I want it to be something that you could sort of come back to, roughly speaking, a chapter a day. I'm not attempting to dictate how people read it, but, to let the perspective shifts that I'm dealing with kind of get under your skin, but also that it could take place right in the middle of an existing life, right? So not something where you think to yourself, oh, right, this is great, a great system for living. And when I get a free week in a few months' time, I'll put it into practice or something like that, which I have done so many times myself as a reader, get very excited about things that I then don't get around to doing. Or that, you have to go off on a retreat to the top of a mountain for several weeks and really get, I wanted it to just be something that could sort of slip into the midst of a busy, distracted life, like all of us are on some level living. And I think specifically the month is a nice amount of time because it's kind of real and substantial. But on the other hand, the end is in sight from the beginning. It's not it's not like do this thing for a year. Like who's going to do anything for a year?
What was really nice for me was that I managed to persuade that I'm sort of semi-retired now, but I do a bit of work repairing sash windows, and we've just got a job at the moment. So I managed to persuade my work colleague to read it at the same time. So we were reading the book,
brilliant.
Each day, and that was really good fun. And it was, as you say, it was something about having a particular concept for a day and just being able to digest it. I think it might have helped because I found that the idea is really useful, but I think it helped to get them to sink in a bit better, especially because I had an opportunity to talk about them a bit, which was fun.
I'm so glad to hear that. No, that sounds ideal. Yeah, I mean, the thinking there as well, I think it's a useful thing to mention maybe is the standard way to go in a book that purports to offer advice, right, is either tips and tricks and systems and techniques, or it's like a big perspective shift. And on some level, maybe I think my previous book, 4,000 Weeks, is maybe one of those sort of perspective shift books. But both of these formats have a bit of a problem. The tips and tricks don't really mean anything unless you do them, unless you're motivated to understand why they would matter.
Yeah.
And the perspective shift can just sort of fade really easily. So I was trying, no doubt imperfectly, but I was trying in this book to kind of make perspective shifts practical and turn them into something that you sort of do. But what they are is changes in the way you see the world, just small changes, rather than, follow these 9 steps to happiness and prosperity or anything like that.
Well, I think that worked really well. It certainly worked for me anyway.
I'm glad to hear it.
Anyway, so let's just dive in a bit then. So you start the book, you've touched on this already, by describing yourself as an imperfectionist. So could you just try and flesh that out a bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is just my sort of umbrella term for the outlook I'm trying to get across. And whether I am an imperfectionist, I mean, I guess I am increasingly, but it's as with everything that one writes about, right? It's the things you've struggled with, not the things that come naturally. So I'm probably still in significant ways the opposite, the perfectionist. But I guess what I mean there is I'm talking about the approach to life that kind of begins from the understanding that there will always be too much to do, that you won't ever be able to produce work as perfect as the images in your head, that you won't be able to fully understand other people or definitely know what's coming next in the future. So in all these different ways, like it's sort of what happens if we sort of start from this very obvious truth of our limitations that, to my mind, an awful lot of advice writing is actually trying to help us deny. And my argument, contrary to some people who have occasionally suspected me of promoting defeatism and resignation, is that actually this is the way to sort of liberate action. And this is the way to be able to get on with things, right? When you're no longer postponing life until this moment when you feel fully in control of it. that's when you can actually plunge more effectively and fully into it right now. So it's sort of the attempt to marry peace of mind with quite sort of a sort of active philosophy of doing things in the world. Mainly because I just get annoyed with the alternatives, right? Which are kind of books about how the only way to achieve that imply that the only way to achieve serenity is to kind of become very passive and check out from the world.
Yeah, and I think there's that certainly works for me, Oliver. But I think there's a little bit of a contradiction in that, in order to but by recognizing that our life is limited and we are finite, then that enables us to have a less limited life. It's that recognition.
Yeah.
You give, and the book's full of really great analogies. There was I love that analogy of the rainstorm.
Oh yeah.
And I think that illustrates that quite well. What was it that if you're in a rainstorm, and you've got a faulty umbrella or something, I can't remember exactly, and you're struggling, but at some point you just let go and allow yourself to get wet, and there's a sense of release in that, and I just love that, and that made a lot of sense to me.
Thank you. Yes. No, this particular kind of move of, I think of it increasingly as sort of unclenching, although that sounds a little bit too biological in some sense. But I think that it's a sort of relaxing into what is already the case, right? Because in that rainstorm image, it's not that like you could stay dry, but instead you should get wet. It's that you're going to get wet. And so you can either brace yourself against the reality that is happening, or you can enter more fully into the reality that is happening. And that's obviously a idea with all sorts of ancient roots. I'm not inventing any of this, but I like that way of thinking about it.
And then there was another early analogy that I really liked, seeing yourself as a kayak rather than a super yacht.
Yeah, this is sort of my way of trying to dramatize the way we're always looking for control. I think that, or a greater sense of control, I suppose I should say, the way that, in many ways you could think of being human as being in a little one-person kayak on a river. You're sort of being carried along by the river of time. You can't predict when it's going to be choppy, when it's going to be calm. The best thing you can do really is sort of steer in the moment using your oars as best you can. And it's a very sort of vulnerable situation that we're in, but also a very kind of, if you really sort of allow yourself to be present there, it's a really sort of exhilarating one as well. It's exciting. Whereas I think a lot of the time what we're trying to do, and what a lot of conventional advice sometimes and self-help is encouraging us to do, is to sort of imagine that really we are, the captain of a huge multi-million-dollar super yacht up on the third story bridge or whatever, very much in control, programming the route into the computer and sitting back while it all gets carried out. And firstly, struggling for that level of control over life when we can't have it as humans is going to be a recipe for suffering. But also, ultimately, maybe the analogy breaks down here because maybe some people are thinking like, I'd love to be on a multi-million-dollar super yacht. But ultimately, there's something missing from that experience of life as well, right? Even if you achieve that level of control, you've given something up, which is, vibrancy or aliveness or something like that.
I think so, yeah. That image also reminds me in a sense of what we describe in our society as the middle way. It's like they realize this idea, if you avoid the absolutes or the comfort in some ways, that you avoid the super yacht, or the fixed views about things, that throws you into the messy, uncertain, at times uncomfortable middle.
Yeah.
But arguably, it's for one thing, it's arguably where you can perhaps get to grips with the phenomena that we can encounter, but more adequately. But also, it's where the interesting stuff happens.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that, and I don't know enough about your society to know like which meanings of this phrase are most salient for you. I obviously am familiar with some vague sense of the middle way from Buddhist traditions. And yeah, the idea that we seek security in concepts that sort of are almost inherently absolute or dichotomous. And so letting go of those, and if that is what the middle way means, is a, it's not a compromise position between the two extremes. It's a different order of existence, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever seen this pictorial image from the Quakers where there's two mules. Have you ever seen
I was raised as a Quaker, so I know this poster very well.
Yeah. Well, to me, that's I suppose the middle way in one sense is a process of negation, a negative thing, because it's a strategy of avoidance. You're avoiding the extremes. But the positive side is like the integration. So the two mules. Just for the listeners, I'll just explain. There's two mules and they're tethered together, and on either end there's two sources of food, aren't there? The two bales of hay, and they're both pulling against each other because they're trying to reach these bales of hay. And you could see them as almost like two opposing desires. You could be like, you're a smoker and, one desire is I want a cigarette, but you've got the opposing conflicting desire that it's bad for you. And anyway, then the next picture, the two mules are sat there and they're exhausted. And then the following picture, the two mules then integrate their desires, if you like, and then they go and eat
one. Both going one way, both going
the other way. And that might be, taking nicotine patches or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's that very strong sense of kind of working with reality instead of trying to dominate or tame or suppress reality through concepts. The phrase I love from the Zen writer, teacher Kosho Uchiyama, who this whole idea of he calls it opening the hand of thought. So implicitly, I think if I'm getting this analogy right, like clenching onto certain kinds of absolutist idea is the opposite, and then opening the hand of thought is like releasing reality from those attempts to sort of, which all put a feeling of security above an engagement with reality. And yeah, exactly.
No, I like that. I like that phrase. Okay, well, back to the book. You in one of the chapters you bring in Sartre in a sense, and his notion of personal responsibility, in particular the importance of engaging with the world in good faith. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I only very briefly mentioned Sartre, and I feel a little insecure propounding any great expertise on the existentialists. But I think where that comes up, talk about it around it a little bit, is this idea of seeing the truth about the choices that we have and that we are free to make. And I begin one of these chapters with a quote from the psychotherapist Sheldon Kopp, who memorably said, "You're free to do whatever you like. You need only face the consequences." And there is this sense that a lot of the time in life, we either sort of feel like we ought to be able to do what we want to do and have there be no downsides, or we feel that we don't have any choice whatsoever because we can't possibly, it's just the way things are done. No one would accept it. It would be impossible in a million ways to do the thing we want to do. And it is a sort of a middle way as well, right? That Kopp is implying here, which is like, no, there will be a downside to the choice that you make, whatever choice you make, but it may be a downside that you're choosing to take responsibility for in that case. And I think that my understanding of what Sartre means by bad faith is sort of going through life pretending that that's not how it is, going through life pretending that you've just got to do certain things or just can't do others. And I give the example in there anonymously of a friend of mine making a decision to leave a marriage. people get very frozen thinking like, well, I can't do that because that would cause people too much pain, the other person too much pain, but I can't do that either because that would just be awful and a different kind of pain. And actually the answer is like, well, which of these kind of pains is the one that is the price that you're willing to take responsibility for? Very often it clarifies things for people very well, because you're sort of you're freer when you see that you can't escape consequences, right? Because it's real freedom, instead of a sort of fake freedom that you're striving towards but can never achieve.
Absolutely. I think there was something that you said something later in the book about perhaps the best advice someone had ever given you was when you were working as a journalist.
Oh, yes.
You were dithering over some piece or something, and anyway, she said, what was it? She said that,
Oh, she'd been she'd been waiting all day as an editor of The Guardian. She'd been waiting all day for me to respond to her question, which is like, do you have the bandwidth, effectively, to take on this other assignment? And I didn't want to take it on because I was so busy, but I also didn't want to disappoint her. So I did neither and kept her waiting all day. And when I finally said, no, I just don't think I have the bandwidth, sorry, she said, very friendly and generous way, far more friendly than I probably had any right to expect, just as a heads up or whatever, it's usually much easier for everyone if you can't do something, if you just say no right away. And years later, I was like, because it stayed with me for some reason, right? The way these things stick in your head. And years later, I was like, oh, that is so wise and generous as well to say it to me, because it's like, not only is your attempt, Oliver, your attempt at keeping everyone happy all the time, making you miserable, but it's not even keeping other people happy, right? It's annoying to have to engage with people who are trying to avoid any negative consequences to what they do. And the negative consequence of her mild dismay, far too strong a word, that I couldn't do that piece and she had to ask someone else to do it, was a price I should have been totally willing to pay. Yeah.
Well, that brings me around to, there's another chapter about rules, and I think, as you say, you make the point that it's more seeing rules as sort of guidelines than truths. Like, it's a good rule in life to not not to tell the truth. But if the mad axeman comes to your door, then you're going to lie, aren't you? If
right.
Ask where your sister is or something.
Yeah.
But could you just maybe expand a bit more on that chapter about rules?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think this is so interesting. I suppose I'm speaking primarily about temporal rules. So it's like, how often you do a thing or what your morning routine is and all these things that people in the productivity space and me for a very long time was completely obsessed by, right? Get the exact set of rules that will kind of make life go. And then all you need to do is follow them to the letter for the rest of your life. And everything is plain sailing. But it doesn't work ultimately, because that is an attempt to sort of the argument I make is that rules can be things that, or should be things that serve life, rather than you end up sort of serving the rule and feeling bad if you don't. And I sort of base this all around the rule of St. Benedict, the monastic schedule that is still in use today, where which has this absolutely fantastic spirit of moderation coursing through it. And apparently, I don't know how much of this is truth and how much is legend, but apparently, when Saint Benedict first attempted to organize monasteries, he did it in a kind of incredibly rigid and disciplinarian way, to the extent that the monks in his charge tried to poison him because they were so sick of what he was doing. But the rule of Saint Benedict that is carried down to us today is this idea that monks living in community definitely need to work and they need to pray, but they also need time to rest, and they need time for solitude, and they need time to be in community. And the idea that like taking one of these variables and just turning it up to 11 is going to achieve anything is not the way forward. And there's this just amazing quote this line that seems so modern in it, where he's talking about alcohol consumption by the monks, and he says something like, the translation depends on, I don't know what the exact words are, but he says something like, ideally monks wouldn't drink any beer or wine, but since the monks of today, his day, can apparently not be persuaded of this, let's at least not drink to the point of intoxication. And so right in the middle of this whole set of rules for how to do the most sort of sacred act of living a monastic life is this kind of incredibly down to earth understanding that, like, people are flawed, and if your rules pretend that they aren't, then no good can come of it.
No good can come of it, absolutely. Another chapter I particularly liked, Oliver, was one that tackled something that I think in our Western culture we really struggle with, but it's important. It's this idea of trying to be kind to ourselves. I'm a Samaritan, and so obviously I'm talking to people often, experiencing distress, and it's often what you want to actually help people move towards. But it's, for most people, just using that language is very, as you say in the book, very cringy. But I just found that chapter and how you looked at that quite sensitively really, really helpful. Could you just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, happily. I mean, yeah, I definitely have had my struggles with the idea of self-compassion or loving yourself and all these things that are so prevalent in certain corners of self-help writing, especially. Now, I understood quite a few years ago now that when something makes me cringe, that is actually a good sign that I might need it rather than that I should avoid it, because it's touching something vulnerable and the cringe is a defense reaction. But still, I didn't find a lot of that writing and a lot of those sort of ideas to be helpful for me. What really shifted my perspective was a couple of things: a work of a philosopher called Ido Landau, and also an essay by the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, which I quote in the book, which asks us to sort of see this situation less as one of needing to kind of blanket yourself with love, which to me smacks of treating oneself as very special or cosseted or something, and instead just draws your attention to how much meaner many of us standardly are in our inner dialogues to ourselves than we would ever dream of being to a friend, or even not a friend, even a person we encountered in the course of the day. If you went up to somebody and said the things to them that many people do find themselves saying to themselves in the course of the day, you'd just be ostracized as a awful, crazy person. And so Ido Landau has this idea of the reverse golden rule, to not treat yourself in ways that you would never treat other people. And what's so lovely about this, I guess maybe it appeals to my sort of Quaker roots as well or something, but it's so just very democratic, right? Nobody's asking me to suggest that I'm the wonderful, super special center of the universe who needs compassion. I'm just being asked to not be any meaner to myself than I would be to other people. And there's something very moving about that idea, and something very arresting in realizing, like, oh, wow, yeah, I wouldn't talk like that to anybody. And yet I do, apparently. So I think that's a very powerful way into that topic.
Just a question here that, this is not particularly about the book, but I'm just curious about your opinion. Apparently there was apparently a few years ago, there was a symposium between scientists from the West and philosophers and psychologists and the Dalai Lama, and seeing where there could be some coming together of ideas. And at one point, a psychologist was speaking to the Dalai Lama about low self-esteem in the West, and he had to have it repeated to him several times because he wasn't aware of the concept. And now it's not to say that people don't suffer in the East, but I think there's something about the self. People see themselves more as a part of community, rather than, there's less this I, me, my perhaps there than here. Anyway, I was just wondering what your thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard that story, and I always wonder, Was this just a translation issue? But it doesn't matter. The point is well made, and even if it's not a sort of cross-cultural difference that is revealed by it, which it might be, um, it does just sort of cause that notion of self-dislike to kind of pop out in new relief, and to be like, this is a very strange notion that you could uh, that you could dislike yourself, even though this is a kind of such an incredibly widespread phenomenon. I think that, of our specific kind of cultural kind of hyper individualism is and competition is really central to that idea. It's not it it's sort of it's individualism that suggests that, like, you've got to go it alone in life, and when you fail, you're a worm, and you sort of beat yourself up about it. But it's a kind of individualism that is very, very heavily invested in sort of other people's thinking and other people's approval, and the idea that, like, what you need to do in society somehow is to go it alone and triumph and take responsibility, but the reward will be that other people take you to be a sort of acceptable member of society. So there's something very strange going on there in that idea that, like, this is Eckhart Tolle has written about this notion of this idea of, like, this thought that he had at one point in his earlier life when he said, I can't live with myself for much longer, and suddenly being like, well, who's the I and the myself in this? Where does this duality come from? Where does it go to? And yeah, so it's a specific flavor of dualism, which obviously, and duality of subject and object, but it's one that we really sort of, we make objects of ourselves and then find ourselves wanting. I think it probably is culturally and economically worsened, if nothing else. Not a very coherent answer, but a fascinating topic.
No, that made a lot of sense to me. What do you mean by operating from sanity rather than striving towards it?
Again, this is just sort of my label for something that I think is important and real and true, and there are many other labels you could come up with, but I take sanity in this idea to just be the basic way in which you would like to show up in your life. In my case, I would say calm, non-anxious, attentive to other people, but, active and productively committed to important goals. Just the basic way I'd like to be. And then how easy it is to turn that into something that you're working towards. Like right now, it can't be the case, but with a bit more effort and discipline and maybe the right system and philosophy, maybe I could get there. And I'm sort of trying to, that is what I call in that section, striving towards sanity. And I'm trying to explain how that outlook usually fails because it positions sanity as something that is out of reach. It's the mindset of somebody who says, I really need to take more time to rest in life, so I'm going to book a sabbatical for a year's time and work really hard until then so that I can get all this stuff out of the way. And then, of course, you've responded to your need for less work by doing more work. And there are lots of other examples of it. Whereas starting from sanity is this notion of figuring out the way you'd like to be and to show up in life, and finding some way to do a bit of that right now. So it's not, so in the case of needing more rest, it would be finding 20 minutes in the course of a very busy day today to really be at ease. It's not only about rest. It could be all sorts of ways you want to be, but like finding a way to be that person in some little imperfect but real way, instead of enshrining it as this sort of perfect, hypothetical, far off goal. There's a writer I quote called Richie Norton who distills it down to a two-step process. He says, 1, decide who you want to be. I mean, that's a bit facetious. That's not something you're going to do in 1 second, but 1, decide who you want to be. 2, act from that identity immediately. And there's something very powerful in that idea. The idea of like taking the kind of creative person you want to be, or the kind of parent you want to be, or spouse, or whatever it is, citizen, and just finding like one way to just embody that, however kind of rubbishly, in reality today. it's just so much more, it's sort of infinitely more meaningful than building all sorts of conceptual castles of what you're going to do in the future.
No, I think that's fantastic, Oliver. There was another thing you said, something similar in the book. You know, if you're considering an act of kindness, just do it. But yeah, anyway, just final couple of questions. What do you think it's about when we recognise how insignificant we are in the great scheme of things that we find so comforting?
I sort of noticed this long before I sort of had anything useful to say about it, but like the fact that, going back to Marcus Aurelius, you know, people have recommended as a source of solace, considering your tiny moment of life in the span of human history, or considering your tiny surroundings in the full extent of the globe. The fact that any of that should bring us comfort is quite odd. And it doesn't bring everyone comfort. Some people think it's very destabilizing, but it really suggests that we go around the rest of the time feeling with a very sort of, well, with an egocentric bias, right? Whether we happen to be egomaniacs or the opposite, we sort of place ourselves right at the center of things, and then get so that as if like all of history was leading up to our lives, or, you know, our neighborhood is the most important place on the planet, and then feel very, very stressed by how difficult it seems to sort of make meaningful choices or do anything that makes a difference. Or, you know, what if I put a foot wrong? Well, if, you know, history's been leading up to me and I screw up some project, that's far worse than if that isn't the case. And so there is something very, very therapeutic, I think, about sort of zooming out and seeing what a tiny little speck of insignificance one is. I don't think it means there's no point in doing anything. I think what it does, and this I'm slightly quoting Ido Landau again here, is it makes you realize that the definition of a meaningful activity that you're working with had better not be one that could only be met by, you know, making a permanent difference all across the world until the end of time, right? It had better include cooking a nutritious meal for your family, or going for a hike in nature, or going and visiting a person who will benefit and be less lonely as a result of your visit. It had better not be something that needs to exist at the level of the cosmos. And if, as you say, you know, if you were to take your work for the Samaritans and try to justify the difference that will make to the whole of humanity in thousands of years, like, why do that to yourself? It's obviously meaningful work in and of itself.
Yeah. I think a phrase that I find really helpful when you know thinking things like this is, I think you can always make things less bad. I'd like that on my gravestone. I think it's just
made things a bit less bad. Yeah.
And that's for me, that's a very imperfectionist way of viewing things. But anyway, I think we'll wrap it up here, Oliver. But it was really, really great to talk to you, and I feel in many ways you're a kindred spirit, and I couldn't recommend your book highly enough. It was such an enjoyable read and really insightful, and for me really quite inspiring. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you. That's really, really good to hear. I certainly haven't transcended the ego enough to not be flattered by such a thing, and it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.